air into the lungs and so on. Now we'll start here by looking at an overview of respiration. And we want to remember that respiration is the process of gas exchange. So it's very different from ventilation, right? You really want to make that distinction in your notes. Ventilation is simply the mechanics of breathing, so just moving air in and out. Respiration is the actual physical exchange of gases. And the gases we're speaking about here are what? Oxygen and CO2. Yep, oxygen and CO2. Now, there are two different forms of respiration. We have internal respiration. This happens on a cellular level. This happens across the inner mitochondrial membrane. We should be familiar with this process. This involves oxidative phosphorylation, the role of oxygen as that final electron acceptor, and so on and so on. And that is respiration on a cellular level. We can also speak about external respiration, so the other parts of that process that facilitate oxygen coming from the atmosphere down to the capillaries across the tissue bed. So the first part of that is ventilating the lungs, so bringing oxygen in. The second part is moving that oxygen from the blood, from the lungs to the blood, as well as moving carbon dioxide from the blood to the lungs. And then the transport of that blood that has the oxygen around the body. And finally, the diffusion of that oxygen and carbon dioxide across the peripheral tissues, okay? So you can think about respiration in two general ways: internal, which is smaller on a cellular level, and external, which is the rest of that process. So we'll start here today by looking at the anatomy of the respiratory system, and then eventually over the course of next week, we'll get into the mechanics of breathing, as well as the pressure gradients and facilitating respiration. Okay, so today we'll look at the upper airway, the respiratory tract, and some of the structures of the thoracic cavity. So we'll start by differentiating the upper airway from the respiratory tract. Now, air comes into our body through the nasal cavity, through the oral cavity, as well as through the pharynx, right? And that is the upper airway. So that's all we'll say about the upper airways, those three structures. Basically the introduction of air up until the pharynx, okay? So from nasal cavity to pharynx is the upper airways. The respiratory tract is the rest of the journey down towards the lungs. So this basically starts at the pharynx and goes all the way down to the rest of the lungs where we have respiration taking place. So there are two distinct regions of the respiratory tract. There's the conducting zone and there's the respiratory zone. Can anyone predict the conducting zone's job? What would be the job of the conducting zone? So conducting that air, right? It's just basically bringing air in and facilitating the passage of air down to the respiratory zone. This is where the magic really happens. The respiratory zone is where we have that exchange of gases, carbon dioxide going out and oxygen coming into the capillaries to be circulated across the body. So two distinct regions here, which are part of another distinct region. So let's kind of back up and make sense of this. We have the upper airway, different from the respiratory tract, and a part of the respiratory tract are two further divisions, the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. Okay, here we can see a really nice illustration of the bronchial tree. So from the larynx all the way down to the alveoli, and we can see that a lot of the structures change or transition throughout this bronchial tree. First off is the diameter. So the diameter changes significantly. We go from about 35 to 45 millimeters all the way down to a really, really tiny diameter. Also, the cilia changes. So cilia, we're going to speak about the function of cilia and goblet cells going forward, but they basically start off very prevalent up in the first part of the respiratory tract, and by the time we get down to the alveoli, they're pretty much non-existent. Cartilage also changes significantly. So at the level of the larynx, we have tracheal rings. Eventually, we get to the trachea where those rings become just C-shaped, can I say that? C-shaped cartilaginous strips that only cover the anterior part of the trachea. And that's really important because we have the esophagus behind the trachea at this point. And so in order to facilitate the expansion of the esophagus when we eat, there needs to be a free surface of the trachea that does not have that cartilaginous ring. When we get to the level of the bronchi, we see that ring reemerge, right? So that ring becomes apparent again when that trachea divides into those two primary bronchi. We can also see that beyond the bronchus, beyond those two divisions, we lose that cartilage in a transition eventually. So it goes from being rings or bands to being just tiny strips along the bronchioles, and then eventually it completely disappears. And that's where we see the emergence of smooth muscle. So what do you think is the purpose of this cartilage? What's the purpose of the cartilage? Sorry? So it doesn't contract, it's more of a rigid structure. Yep, so it's going to maintain and protect the shape of the airway. Excellent. So that's going to keep the airway nice and patent. And then eventually when we lose that cartilage down towards the end, that is going to become smooth muscle. Smooth muscle has the ability to contract and relax, and that will take over the role of maintaining the patency.